2017 marks the 100-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution of 2017, that is, which, if you go by the Gregorian calendar as opposed to the Julian calendar, would actually be called the November Revolution, but hey, let's not get stuck splitting hairs. A little bit of backstory here. The first iteration of Russian Revolution actually came more than a decade earlier in January 1905, when some 200,000 Russian citizens, fed up with war and inequality, marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to deliver a petition to Tsar Nicholas II, hoping to sway him towards reform. The petition was never delivered. The imperial guards opened fire on the crowd of peaceful protesters and killed hundreds of men, women, and children. Bloody Sunday, as it is commonly referred to, prompted waves of strikes and protests throughout Russia. The Tsar, as despots are wont to do, made a lame attempt at appeasement by creating a state Duma in 1906, essentially a legislative body elected by the people, tasked with taking up the concerns of the people, and supposedly endowed with oversight powers. However, the Tsar, again as despots are wont to do, made sure that he retained ultimate power in the form of a final veto, the ability to dissolve the Duma anytime he pleased, plus the added hurdle of the State Council, a noble, stacked, and half-Tsar-appointed body that oversaw the Duma and had final say on any legislation that they hoped to pass. While the first and second Dumas included leftist factions, not least of all the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, of which Lenin's Bolsheviks were a part, subsequent Dumas fell victim to the Tsar's autocratic powers, ensuring that businessmen, gentry, and landowners won the majority of seats, thanks to Tsar Nicholas's decree that gifted greater electoral value to each vote for a landowner versus a lesser value to each vote that went to misled members of the peasantry. Kind of like today's fractional voting. Because, fuck poor people. Needless to say, the Dumas were unsuccessful in reforming Russia's autocratic nightmare, which brings us up to just about 100 years ago. In March of 1917, February on their calendar, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated following an incident where the Tsar's order to fire upon protesters in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, literally backfired when some 60,000 soldiers ultimately joined the activists, taking over the city and torching government buildings and offices. Of course, this was just one of many riots and strikes that broke out over perpetual corruption and the dire lack of food, most notably caused by Russia's role in the First World War, something neither the economy nor the people supported. Following the Tsar's abdication, the provisional government that took power, made up of members from the last Duma and led by Alexander Kerensky, was useless, but well-intentioned at best. Although it managed to pass initiatives such as political freedom and freedom of the press, it foolishly chose to further Russia's role in World War I. Ironically, much thanks to the newfound freedom of the press, the Bolsheviks and Lenin's call for peace, land, and bread became far-reaching and far more appealing than more war under a half-assed government that, due to its splintered structure, couldn't effectively govern anyway. Fast forward to November, or late October in the Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks staged a coup, a surprisingly bloodless one, after which Lenin and the Bolsheviks officially ruled Russia. Now, even if I dedicated several shows to the events of the Russian Revolution, I would miss out on key details that are necessary to really define and therefore analyze the outcome and subsequent fucked-uppery of communist Russia. That being said, here's a brief rundown on what went wrong. What came to pass under the Bolsheviks. Dissenting socialists, anarchists, and activists outside the party were shot or imprisoned. Soviets, which essentially refers to local or district councils, were forced under the yoke of Lenin, Trotsky, and the party. Lenin himself wrote in late 1917, "We passed from workers' control to the creation of the Supreme Council of National Economy." In other words, the entire concept of socialism, which Lenin had stood on the barricades for, the main goal of a government and economy run by the workers, fizzled very soon after it was promised. Defenders of Bolsheviks and Lenin will say that the situation in Russia in 1917 was hardly ideal, with millions starving in a shattered economy. The argument is that although Lenin believed in this workers' paradise, Russia's then present socioeconomic shitstorm made the manifestation of those ideas impossible, requiring not only, according to Marx's communist evolution, a push to first build capitalism before getting to socialism, but also requiring a more strict hierarchical and centralized command. No autonomous Soviets with flat structures, despite the fact that many workers were already manifesting such situations. But can we really blame Lenin? Did the circumstances of the place and time really disallow his promises to be fulfilled? As outlined in a 1970 essay in the UK socialist magazine Solidarity, the disorganization created by the war and by the resistance of the employing class, manifested as sabotage or desertion of their enterprises, clearly made it imperative to minimize and, if possible, eliminate unnecessary struggles between factory committees, such as struggles for scanty fuel or raw materials. There was clearly a need to coordinate the activity of the committees on a vast scale. The point at issue is not that a functional differentiation was found necessary between the various organs of working class power, such as Soviets, factory committees, etc., or that a definition was sought as to what were local tasks and what were regional or national tasks. The important thing is that a hierarchical pattern of differentiation was externally elaborated and imposed by an agency other than the producers themselves. In other words, yes, we can blame Lenin. Lenin and the party became the establishment that they had worked so hard to overthrow. The workers did not govern, nor did they have control over their own means of production. Points that could and should have been primary regardless of the socioeconomic situation, which, by the way, didn't come out of nowhere, but was one that Lenin and the party were well aware of during their campaigns, indeed since the early 1900s. Fast forward to the death of Lenin in 1924 and Stalin's rise to power, and we all have a pretty good idea of whether or not the party ever fulfilled their promise of a just and equal society. And let me take this moment to make the distinction between the execution of ideas and the ideas themselves. The incredible and tireless work of many activists in the Russian Revolution should serve as inspiration and beacons of hope. Our flat understanding of the Russian Revolution in this country leaves out the powerful statements and work of dissidents who risked and gave their lives for the dream of equality and justice. And perhaps most importantly, it leaves out the strong parallels to our struggles today. Indeed, even as Lenin put it before his unprincipled shift, capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. Or how about this quote? Democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is the democracy of capitalist society. It's almost as if he plagiarized this shit from a Truth Out article or something. These same beasts of empire and capitalism haunt us today, 100 years later. We're on the same barricades. And in order to remove ourselves from this perpetual loop of oppressors and oppressed, we have to learn the lessons etched on these age-old barricades. We have to learn that we can't hope for reform from the oligarchs, the autocrats, the despots. Appealing to the Tsar, it didn't work. Lining up to vote for a powerless Duma rigged for the nobility didn't work. Hell, appealing to King Louis XVI of France didn't work either, even though the French citizens did try many times. In that same vein, know when your tight hold of an ideology becomes a stranglehold on the very people that you had hoped it would help. For example, Lenin believed that because Russia was so technologically and indeed economically behind the rest of the Western world, that Russia would first have to work on bolstering capitalism before evolving to socialism under the Marxist theory of communist evolution. Trotsky argued otherwise, suggesting that Russia did not need to build up capitalism first in order to attain a socialist structure. Now there are pros and cons in both perspectives. Basically, read political analysis and study, but don't cling to any projected path to utopia, because guess what? That shit never works out in practice, only in theory. Ideologies by definition and in the interest of self-preservation do not and cannot bend to the change in circumstances. We have to be ideologically anarchical. Don't prescribe to any one ism. You will find yourself tied to it, hoping for a buoy as it sinks. And finally, as Nietzsche put it, beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. In the realm of politics, there will always be a reason why you just had to skip out on that promise. The times were just too tough and you didn't have the power to, blah, blah, blah. But as one anarchist blogger put it in their analysis of the Russian Revolution, ultimately, if difficult times back in 1918 to 21 justified suppressing working class freedom and self-management, imprisoning and shooting anarchists and other socialists, implementing and glorifying party dictatorship, what might we expect in difficult times in the future? This slippery slope is the creator of monsters. Just ask the Democrats. So don't try to reform the unreformable. Understand your place and time. Don't cling to ideologies. And careful lest you revolutionaries become the monsters that you're fighting. In honor of all the dedicated activists from 100 years ago to 100 episodes ago to today, to the front lines, to the fight.